What up, everybody? No good takes. A little bit of an impromptu live here. Shouldn't be too long. Don't have the headset. Don't have the microphone. Good room to record in. If you look around here, it's like I'm in my own little jail cell here. Not that I want to be in one, but this is as good of a place as any to record without any of my setups. It's gonna be a quick one. I know Mike and Bunk and Gabe have been talking your guys' ears off about it. I know that we can't get enough of it, and I'm not trying to make this a Mets heavy podcast over the last week, but a lot has gone on. I have yet to give my 2 cents about it, and it's because I've been thinking a really long time about it. And originally, emotionally, I was hurt, and that's what I was leading with. I said, David Stearns, how could you do this? And still here today, that's my mindset. I know that a lot of the arguments has been, well, when you have the richest owner in baseball, you got to be able to cough up this money in these contracts. And while I am under the belief that Pete Alonso has good productive years ahead of him, I don't think that you can question the Mets have probably gotten the best years out of Pete Alonso. He's a negative defender, and I know that I'm trying to justify this, and believe me, like I'm upset. I'm hurt by this, and if I was a Mets fan, I mean I am, but if I was Steve Cohen, I'm probably asking him to spend that and say, look, he's your franchise's home run leader. He's been a cornerstone of this team since he's been called up. He, at worst, has been a 34 home run hitter. The guy has earned his respect. He's earned a contract. And look around the league. Boston didn't offer more than 3 years. Chicago, I forget what their offer was, but Baltimore ended up being the clear favorite. So that kind of tells you where Pete's market was at. But I do have a lot of at least thoughts on this. So I think that there's no better thought than to say, I feel as though David Stearns could be dodging some accountability here. And let me be clear by what I mean by that. I really think that you look to 2025 last season, what was the Mets' biggest flaw? It was the rotations. David Stearns clearly did not build a rotation to last for a 162 game season, and it bit the Mets, and it bit them hard. And I'm not here to say that was the end all be all of why the season went wrong. There were still plenty of other reasons. At the end of the day, I know we look at Juan Soto's numbers and whatnot and say he had an incredible season, but let's be honest, his season felt pretty hollow. I think you could say that about a lot of Mets players. Francisco Lindor, even at times of Pete Alonso, even though he carried the Mets for the opening month, he had some pretty good numbers through the back half of the month, about back half of the year. But the Mets felt like a very hollow team. They lacked a big hit like they had in 2024 time and time again. And at the end of the day, when you blow a division lead like you had, when you were, 21 games over 500 and you barely squeeze out a 500 record, that's a problem. You know, if I told you at the end of the year the Mets were in a game 162 to make the playoffs with 83 wins, you would say something drastically wrong happened. And it did happen. This team fell apart. And now we know the reports of, well, the clubhouse was an animosity most of the season. Lindor and Soto had a chilly relationship, even though I don't think we need to buy into that as much as the Lindor and McNeil thing. Chilly relationships happen. You know, I don't remember hearing any stories about Soto and anyone else being best of buds, but it was clearly something of note. So I'm not going to throw it off to the side, but I will take it with a grain of salt. But now seeing how Stearns is so reluctant to give out these long-term deals, it's pretty clear to me that Juan Soto was a direct product of Steve Cohen saying, "This is our guy. I don't care what you say." No, I'm as far from okay as you can be. No, not at all. As saying that this is our guy, but it hurts. It's a very, very tricky situation to cope with as a fan. From just analyzing it from an outsider perspective, some of this does make sense. David Stearns preaches his run prevention. That's why he got rid of Brandon Nimmo. You have an old Marcus Semien. The bat's not there anymore, but he's still a plus defender. I was defending that deal, by the way. I said, you know what? You get out of a pretty rough Brandon Nimmo contract, someone who's putting up good numbers still, but is not the greatest defender, has a weaker arm, has a history of injuries. I really think that being tied to Brandon Nimmo for those 5 years could hurt more than it helps you. And also, that's freed up money. That was money to give to Edwin Diaz. That was money to give to Pete Alonso. And I was saying to myself, this is great. This is very, very great. But with the terms and ideas of where the Mets could be going in the future, I'm lost right now. It feels as though David Stearns is operating kind of how Houston operates, with reluctant to give out these long-term deals. But there's clearly a new direction that the Mets are going to be under. It's going to be with Juan Soto leading the way, as it should be. Francisco Lindor, whatever good years you have left of him, there are plenty of good years left. But, Lindor's in his prime right now. When the Mets, how young of a team they're about to become if they don't make any more moves, you're kind of wasting Lindor's prime. And you have your young pitchers, McLean, Sproat, Tong, and we'll see what the Mets want to do with Tariq Skubal and whatnot. So it definitely is a slippery slope where the Mets are right now and David Stearns. And I think Stearns has been stubborn. He's down to this ideology of how he wants to run the team. And in a certain way, I kind of agree with him. I know what we say, richest owner in sports, you got to be able to pay that money. But we saw in 2023 what the richest owner in sports did. It was reckless spending. Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander, reckless spending in 2023. And I'm not saying that Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz are reckless spending. I think they're pretty good contracts. I mean, Alonso, 31 a year into his age 36 season. I'm not loving that. 36 or 37 season. I'm not loving that, especially with the defensive game that he plays, even though he isn't as bad of a defender as I think metrics make it out to be. One of the best scoopers in the league. I know he has issues throwing over to the pitcher at first. I think he got Senga injured clear as day, and not the most mobile guy out there, but the defense that he has been under the gun for, you would act like he's losing the Mets games at first. He's not. And he's scooping balls and he's doing a pretty good job. And he's better than what the Mets want to roll out there. The rumors of McNeil and Goldschmidt platooning and Mark Vientos having a spot at first base. If you want to talk about run prevention, I don't think that maybe Goldschmidt, but McNeil and Vientos at first base, you want to talk about run prevention? That goes against what Stearns is preaching. So I'm a little confused there. And another thing that has become perfectly clear to me that nobody has brought up yet, if the Mets don't make that big splash, if New York doesn't go out and get Kyle Tucker, a Cody Bellinger, a Tariq Skubal with a monster trade, which I really don't want to happen given the state of the team right now, it's pretty clear to me that Carlos Mendoza is safe of a job. Because what Stearns has done with this team over the last week or so, winter meetings took an absolute beating. He has not put out a playoff team on the field. He has not. And another interesting aspect to me is, let's think about it. Let's back up here. Pete Alonso, the Mets were never going to go over 3 years with him. That became clear as day. Mets were always reluctant to go over 3 years with him. It was a mess last season. Steve Cohen saying it was tougher to re-sign Pete Alonso than it was with Juan Soto, which is a crazy statement. We know that Scott Boras has a headache, but David Stearns is a headache too. Let's not paint this how it's not. Stearns is a headache. So if you know the Mets were never going to be able to go over 3 years with him, they never wanted to do that. You knew other teams were going to. Pete Alonso was never in this team's long-term plans. It's clear as day, and it sucks. With Steve Cohen and his comments to the New York Post about saying it's a long offseason left, I know how you fans feel. You have every right to feel that way. Cohen knew. Steve Cohen knew Pete Alonso was never coming back. And that is my silver lining in all of this. That's my saving grace, that the Mets knew that Alonso was never going to come back. The Mets had at least concepts of a trade in place for Brandon Nimmo to go and get off of that contract. So something's got to be coming, right? Am I crazy for thinking that? Steve Cohen, who grew up a Mets fan, who promised the Mets fans a World Series by 2026, clock is ticking. Here we are, Uncle Stevie. And I'm not saying that they're going to have to go and compete this year, because clearly I don't think there's enough this team can do in one offseason to go and compete, losing a 40-plus home run hitter, losing Brandon Nimmo, who has still productive years in his bat, losing the best closer in baseball with a bullpen that was taxed and overworked because of a rotation that couldn't get past 5 innings most of the time. It's clear the Mets are not going to be in a spot to compete for a World Series. Too much needs to be fixed. And you got to remember, re-signing Edwin Diaz, re-signing Pete Alonso, not trading Brandon Nimmo wasn't to make the Mets better. That was just to get them back to square one, which was an 83-win team. Which, keep in mind, is another reason why I can sit here on the other side of the coin and say, I understand. It was an 83 win team. A lot of that goes to the rotation. A lot of that goes to the bullpen. But let's address the elephant in the room here. We have had the core of Francisco Lindor, Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, whoever else, Jeff McNeil, even though he's a shell of what he was. We've had this since 2021. What have we seen since then? The Mets collapsed in 2021. COVID with the expanded playoffs, they couldn't even get in. 2022, 101 wins. You didn't make it out of a wild card round because you ran out of steam at the end of the year. You let the Braves catch you, even though they were playing amazing baseball. You should have never lost to the Padres as a 101 win ball club. Look at Detroit this year. They lost out on the AL Central. They were a game away from the ALCS. Didn't let it stop them. It is ridiculous to me. It's ridiculous to me. It's the best way to put it. This core underachieved. Greatly, they underachieved. So you can't ignore that. Do I blame Stearns for letting Pete Alonso walk? No, but I wish they would have offered him something. It's a slap in the face. And there is a huge difference, and you got to draw a line here of business and emotion. And David Stern runs strictly on business. And hey, Mets fans, this is what we knew was going to happen, right? You saw what Billy Epler did in 2023. It was reckless spending. Again, the Verlander contract, the Scherzer contract, that's reckless spending by the New York Mets, by Steve Cohen, trying to buy himself a baseball team and learning quickly it doesn't work like that. And with David Stearns, remember the rotation wasn't addressed in 2024, and we hated it. And there was an outrage. There was an outcry. They were 2 games away from the World Series. Granted, they got off to one of the worst starts of the season, 0-5, and in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. They were one of the hottest teams from June on to the postseason. But it was still an 89-win ball club. And I'm not trying to sit here and act ungrateful for what we got as fans that season. 2024 was great. Don't get me wrong. It was an 89-win ball club. I mean, when I tell you the core of Brandon Nimmo, Francisco Lindor, who finished second in MVP voting that year, Pete Alonso, who, again, granted, didn't have a great 2024, but had heroics in that postseason and then had a great 25, as we know, I'm expecting more than 89 wins. I'm expecting the 90 to 95 win threshold, and I know it's a game off, and you could sit here and say, well, Giuseppe, now you're reaching. Maybe I am. But the core and the talent that this Mets team had was never going to win a World Series. Let's call it as it is. Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, Juan Soto, Francisco Lindor, I don't think that core is ever going to win a World Series. Now, am I going to sit here and tell you that the platoon of Jeff McNeil and Paul Goldschmidt at first base and seeing what other options there are out there, older and defensively sound, is that going to win a World Series? Absolutely not. But the Mets are getting younger. Jet Williams is waiting in the wings. Carson Bench has every opportunity to be the team's starting opening day center fielder. Even Jet Williams has the case to be on this opening day roster, whether he's starting or not. And Ryan Clifford is now in the conversation. Is he going to be ready by opening day? No, I'd be absolutely shocked if he is. But the fact of the matter is, you got to throw his name in there now. You do. If the Mets don't make a move at first base, Ryan Clifford is a name you're going to have to bring up, even though I know he won't be ready by opening day, but it's a long season. You don't know where it's going to be. So where we sit now is interesting. Where do the Mets go from here? I'm going to be totally honest. I don't think they go very far. The reports that the Mets have not been in on Kyle Tucker and Cody Bellinger, I believe it. Maybe Bellinger is a more realistic option. You'll get him for a shorter-term deal, but we know what Kyle Tucker is asking for. That's why he hasn't been signed yet. The dude's market is tanked. Maybe you get Kyle Tucker. I know Mike and Bunk brought it up. I'm going to steal their idea right from them. Maybe you get them on a Bregman-type deal. Bring him in. He can opt out and see how he does. If not, you just have him for 3 or 4 years. But, Tucker is, 28 years old now? He's entering his prime. He's looking for a big contract. He's an outstanding ball player. Don't get me wrong, but it's clear as day that Stearns does not want to be tied to anybody long-term. If I could be a fly on the wall when Stearns was brought in, Steve Cohen said, look, we got to get Soto. We're in on Soto, and he's a free agent. He is going to be a player that we must bring in to show that we are going to compete. And again, credit to Steve Cohen. I know he's losing the fan base here, but give the guy credit. He came in, he put his money where his mouth is. He spent his money on some contracts that were pretty hard to defend. Scherzer, Verlander. I mean, at the time, Scherzer had good years and you thought you could get something out of him, but the money, they paid these guys greatly. And I know you flipped them at the deadline and you got prospects back. And I mean, one of them now is with San Francisco, but whatever it may be. But he's putting the money where the mouth is, man. He would have paid Pete Alonso. Look at it like this. If Billy Epler was still here, Pete Alonso would be a lifelong Met. I have no question about that. Put it like this. If Billy Epler were here, Edwin Diaz would have 5 years waiting for him. And timeout. I'm not sitting here saying I want Billy Epler. That was a mess. That was a you-know-what show. I'm not sitting here praising Billy Epler at all. But my point is that if Stearns was willing to pay these guys long-term and pay the big bucks, Steve Cohen would have no problem doing it. Steve Cohen spent. So I don't want to hear the complaints that Steve Cohen is getting outbid for these guys. They're not offering these guys contracts, okay? And when it comes to the Edwin Diaz situation and him not bringing the Dodgers offer back to New York to match or go higher, be mad at Edwin Diaz all you want, but you're wrong. You should be mad at the Mets, at this cutthroat, ice-cold approach, saying it's business. Because let's be honest, losing Jeremy Hefner, I understand wanting to clean house. He wasn't a problem. Anton Richardson wasn't a problem. He almost had Juan Soto a 40-40 season. Think about that. Juan Soto, a bad defender, not the fastest guy out there, not known for his base running, almost had a 40-40 season. And you're going to tell me Anton Richardson had nothing to do with that. Really? And you couldn't bring him back? These matter. These guys matter to these players. So that's one thing. You make Edwin Diaz upset not bringing him back. Two, with Devin Williams, and I want you to stay with me here, with Devin Williams being signed by the New York Mets and the Mets not informing Edwin that they were going to go in on that, the Mets have no obligation to Edwin Diaz. They don't owe Diaz to say, hey, we're thinking about bringing in Devin Williams. Don't worry, though. Your job is still safe if you want to get signed. I know that upset Edwin Diaz, but he does not have the right to say, I'm upset by that. That's business. People are going to get brought in. They're going to be let go. Business is business. But this is where you do side with Edwin Diaz. That there were plenty of rumors and speculations that the Mets were not willing to go over 4 or 5 years with Edwin Diaz. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to pay him another $100 million contract. Can you blame them? I think you could. I would do it. He's awesome. Love Edwin Diaz. If the bidding got that high for him, I would be ready to do that. He's the best closer in baseball. And the fact the Dodgers got him for what they got him at is ridiculous. And look, be mad at the Dodgers all you want. You didn't want to come back to the Mets. All right? He did not want to come back to the Mets, and that's on the Mets. When you realize the kind of contract situation that Edwin Diaz was heading into, knowing that David Stearns has become notorious for not wanting to give these guys long contracts, notorious for not wanting to pay the big bucks to guys who you can argue deserve it, Edwin Diaz saw that signing, and he probably said to himself, well, they're done with me. They're not going to offer me anything. If this goes to 4 or 5 years, they're just going to throw me to the curb and say, hey, good luck. We're going to trust the pitching lab, and I've heard too much of, by the way, and trust that we can turn Devin Williams into what he was, the airbender, the great Devin Williams. And that is where I side with Edwin Diaz. That is where you had to inform him because he didn't know he was going to come back to the Mets. And the fact that he didn't bring that contract offer from the Dodgers back to the Mets to see if they would offer it, he's been with the Mets for 5 years. He has a home in New York. For him to not even go back to the Mets and offer to see if they can match it or do better, that says a lot about the Mets and where they are. That says a lot about what the players think about the Mets. And to think of where they were a year ago, and all of these players loving Steve Cohen, loving David Stearns, loving this idea that the Mets have built, it's amazing how much a year can change. It really is. And we've said that 2 years in a row now for total different reasons. 2023, total disaster. It's amazing how much a year can change. The Mets were 2 games away from the World Series. It's crazy to think that after watching 2025 and watching this offseason so far. A year later, the Mets sign Juan Soto to the biggest contract in professional sports history. They miss out on the playoffs. You just lost someone who was supposed to be a lifelong Met, 2 guys who were supposed to be lifelong Mets, and Nimmo and Pete Alonso. You lost the best closer in baseball for a contract that you could have matched, that you could have beaten out. But Edwin Diaz was so displeased with how the Mets have treated him this offseason, he didn't even want to. And I know another reason of it was Alexis Diaz, his brother, and praising what the Dodgers have done in that organization when he pitched for them. But still, for somebody to spend 5 years in New York, to have a terrible 2019, learn how to pitch in New York, become a premier closer. He would have been the best closer in Mets history. Not even a question if he stayed for the next even 3 years, I think. For him to not even come back with that offer, that says more about the Mets than Edwin Diaz. So be mad at Edwin Diaz all you want, but you should really be mad at the Mets for putting him in that situation to feel that he didn't even want to come back. That is on the Mets more than anybody else. So I still have a few more points, then I'll get out of here. We brought up Mendoza's job being safe. We brought up Stearns kind of dodging accountability about the wrong things he did to build this team. We brought up Cohen, DeSoto signing being much more of a Cohen want than a Stearns want. Yeah, again, a lot of other things here. We look back on the Mets core. We love them. Fan service. They didn't get it done most of the time. They underperformed more often than not. And also another thing here. With Jet Williams and Carson Bench and whatever other prospects that could become getting called up, the worst thing you could do, or could be in professional sports, in my opinion, is be a prospect on a team that's ready to win now. You see it everywhere. Brett Beatty was stunted, his growth coming up and down. Mark Vientos going up and down, his growth was stunted. Francisco Alvarez took over, but I think he was called up a little too soon. It's going to be a good thing for these young kids at the very least if the Mets make no more moves. Carson Bench can go Carson Bench can go through the growing pains of being a young kid in the MLB. Jet Williams can do the same thing. And as a Met fan, you expect to win now after 2024. After 2025, it was still there. You still had players who had outstanding seasons like Pete Alonso, like Brandon Nimmo. But, you still have a young rotation to work out. You're going to get Nolan McLean for a year. Jonah Tong will be back up eventually. You'll see what you have with Brandon Sproat. And that's not to mention Clay Holmes coming back, Sean Manaea, a healthy Sean Manaea. The rotation is going to be very young. They'll probably get hit around more often than not as, teams starting to figure these guys out. But look, I think that's where the Mets are heading right now. They want to become younger. They want to build this new core. And if I could be totally wrong, and these guys could all be packaged for Tariq Skubal tomorrow, but judging how David Stearns has run with this team as of lately, I think he wants to get younger. Now, when it comes to what in the future, when it's time to offer Carson Bench a deal, Jet Williams a deal, Nolan McLean a deal, if these guys are still with the Mets at the time, then I truly wonder what's going to happen. If they're going to be dished out and they're going to get younger again. It feels like as long as David Stearns is around, the window is always going to be short for the Mets to compete. That's my honest opinion on it. All right, a few more points, then we'll get out of here. It becomes pretty clear the Mets have shifted from building around Lindor to building around Soto. And not a doubt in my mind. The fact that Juan Soto is 27 years old, assume that somebody's prime is from 28 to 31, 32 in baseball. That's a long prime. He's already a generational hitter. I think the Mets are going to try and compete now around that aspect and not this aspect, even though they can still totally compete now with what they had. Let's see what else here. I think it's everything. I think I nailed it on the head with everything I wanted to get out of here. It's a quick little live stream. I just wanted to get my thoughts out there. Look, it's upsetting. As a fan, emotionally, it's upsetting. A business standpoint, you got to see where it goes. There's a Ted Lasso quote, be curious, not judgmental. And I think that's what we need to do right now as Mets fans. Be curious, not judgmental. There's a long offseason left. There was always a plan in mind because if Steve Cohen really wanted to, we know he could step in and say we're signing Pete Alonso. He's got say over everything. But he must have been clearly convinced that the Mets can go in a better direction with a new young nucleus under a Stearns-led vision. We're going to have to see, though. It's a long offseason. I think the Mets are going to become younger. They're going to become much worse if nothing changes. But we're going to have to wait and see. So I'll do it. A quick little live stream here. Thank you for everybody tuning in. We got a good number of viewers, I think, this time around. Let's see. Do we have a top comment to get out of here? 677. That's a good one. You suck, dude. We could probably leave it at that. That's fine. By the way, I don't mind. Oh, by the way, I call the Panthers being potentially good this season, and somebody called me a brain-dead idiot. So who's the brain-dead idiot? Not me. All right, let's get out of here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. That'll do it. No good takes. Just wanted to get off and rant about the Mets and whatnot. Still a long offseason, though. Keep your head up. We're going to see what happens with this team. At the very least, they'll be younger. The expectations will be lower. And that gives me a little something to look forward to. I don't know. But that'll do it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I will see you guys all very, very soon.